This is Bigger Questions with your host, Robert Martin.
Welcome to Bigger Questions, recorded live in Melbourne's CBD. Today's big question: did Jesus have to die? We asked this question today to Sam Reeve. Sam is Senior Minister of CrossCulture, a church in the heart of Melbourne. Sam has previously worked in Pakistan and in theological education in Australia, and he joins me now. Please welcome Sam Reeve. Sam, welcome to Bigger Questions.
Thanks, Rob.
It's great you can be here. Now, Sam, you're the pastor of a church right at Melbourne Central. What's that like?
It's fantastic.
Yeah? In what way? What makes it so fantastic?
Well, we have about 50,000 people a day go past our door. Mm-hmm. And if you open the door, some of them come in.
Okay, right.
And some of them, they've got all sorts of
Sleep
needs.
there or something, do they? Or?
Well, yeah, we have that as well. But some of them come and say, tell us what Christianity's all about.
Yeah.
How can I become a Christian?
People ask you that question?
Yeah, they do.
In Melbourne
Sometimes,
today?
yeah. Sometimes they just want some help, or they want they're in deep need, want someone to pray for them.
Mm-hmm. And you offer them some things to help them with their needs that they have?
Yes, we can. Yeah, as much as we can. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, we have regular things like meal for the homeless and refugee programs, English learning programs, that kind of stuff.
Terrific. Right, in Melbourne Central, and 50,000 people a day?
Yeah, they don't all come in.
Right, okay, because that's a big church, that's right.
That's right.
Anyway, to kick off bigger questions, we like to ask a couple of smaller questions. We do try to have a bit of fun on the show. So Sam, as today's question is about Jesus, we thought we'd ask you a couple of smaller questions about how much you know about the impact of Jesus. Now, do you feel qualified at all to answer this question?
No, not really. I'm still getting to know Jesus after 50 years of trusting him, but let's give it a go.
We'll give it a go. We'll see how you go. There's two questions, both at multiple choice. In 1966, one of the members of the famous band The Beatles said, "We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." Now, which member of The Beatles said this? Was it A, John Lennon, B, Ringo Starr, C, Paul McCartney, or D, George Harrison?
I think it was the first one.
John Lennon.
Yes.
And you're right. Yes, it is. Congratulations. Yes, John Lennon. Yes. Now it's, yeah. Well, why not, hey? Give him an applause. It wasn't that hard, I didn't think. But anyway, it's interesting. If you compare Jesus to the Beatles on Google Trends today, Jesus is searched for on average between 10 to 15 times more than the Beatles. So perhaps he was a little bit premature in suggesting that.
He didn't have the gift of prophecy, did he?
No, he didn't, no. But it's also interesting that interest in Jesus tends to peak around Easter and Christmas time. That's when Jesus is searched for more times.
Wow.
And there's also seems to be more interest in searching for the name Jesus in Mexico as well. Perhaps they're looking for a relative or a friend or something perhaps as well. Anyway,
Right.
Question 2. Who said, "I am not a believer, but I must confess that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very centre of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all history"? Was it A, Bertrand Russell, the great sceptical philosopher? B, H.G. Wells, the great author of War of the Worlds? C, Napoleon Bonaparte, the great military and political leader? Or D, Beyoncé, the great singer and dancer?
All of them should have said it, but I think Napoleon. I'll go for Napoleon.
Okay, well, you could, but unfortunately it's wrong. I'll give you a second chance. If you wanted to go for another one, which one, again in the top half of the list perhaps?
What about Bertie Russell?
Or perhaps it could have been...
H.G.
Wells.
Wells.
It was H.G. Wells, that's right. Yeah. So H.G. Wells...
Get it right
mate,
after all.
You did eventually, yeah, that's right. Well, Sam, you nearly got 2 out of 2. You got 1 out of 2 of our bigger questions right. You passed our quiz. So please, a big round of applause for Sam. Now, so Sam, we're talking about Jesus, a remarkable person, someone who's searched for on the internet, someone who remains more popular than the Beatles, and whom H.G. Wells regarded as the most dominant in all history. So what do you think makes Jesus so impressive?
Where do you start? Jesus was the most complete human being that ever lived. Mm-hmm. I think 2 things stand out to me. Firstly, his humility.
Yeah.
I think most of us, most human beings, we try to improve our life. We try to get the next job up the line. We try to get the next better investment or improve ourselves, get on somehow. And that doesn't seem to have any end. You know, people who are in charge of $50 billion companies want to find a $100 billion one to be in charge of. But Jesus did the opposite. He had the top spot. He's the ruler, creator of the whole universe. And he voluntarily took on the bottom spot. The Bible tells us he became a slave for the purpose of dying. To me, that's really, really impressive.
The absolute humility that he demonstrates.
Yes, and I think the other thing is that drove that, his compassion. That when we see it throughout his life, you read the Gospels over and over again, it says Jesus had compassion on them. You know, people with leprosy, people whose kid had died, or people who are tortured by demons or whatever. He was just filled with compassion, and of course that's what drove him to do what our question asks today.
Yeah. But also, does that compassion, is that what in some ways inspired by Jesus' compassion is what drives you and your church to care for those who have need around your church?
Yes, yeah, we hope so.
Yeah?
Yeah. I can't speak for everybody, but I think we try to reflect what he's like. And I think the thing too about Jesus' compassion, like most of us can be compassionate to our friends and our mates and people we like, but Jesus is actually compassionate to his enemies, which is
That's pretty tough.
just a whole different level altogether.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So what is it about Jesus that particularly impresses you then, Sam?
well, those two things that personally I've experienced, his love and his compassion and his forgiveness. Yeah, so to me that's the standout.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other things I could talk about. His integrity and his justice and his holiness. He's a very, very compelling person.
Yeah, well, as H.G. Wells says, he's the most dominant in all history, and probably for good reason. Today we're asking Sam Reeve today's big question: did Jesus have to die? And given that Jesus is such a dominant figure in history, we come to a story recorded about him in the Bible, which is perhaps surprising. In chapter 14 of the Gospel of Mark, which is one of the 4 biographies of Jesus' life that we have, Jesus goes with 3 of his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. Jesus goes off and prays, and he becomes deeply distressed and troubled. And so in the passage there, he prays, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Now, Sam, this seems puzzling because if you read through the Gospel of Mark, Jesus always seems powerful and in control, yet here he's overwhelmed. So is this significant?
Definitely. He's coming to face the whole reason why he came to earth. And I think he's facing up to the horror of what that actually means.
Yeah.
So
what's he facing up to?
Yeah, he's come to, earlier in Mark's Gospel, he said he's come to give his life as a ransom for many, to buy people back out of slavery. And he, of all people, understood the depth of what that meant and what it was going to cost to do that.
Yeah.
Not just in physical terms, but spiritually as well. So he's, sizing that all up.
So what was it going to cost him?
His life.
Yeah.
And separation from the Father, taking on himself the penalty and the guilt of our wrongdoing. Yeah, and for an innocent person to do that, that's a big deal.
Yeah. A question has come, just to clarify something you've just asked. What do you mean by buying people out of slavery?
Well, the Bible makes it pretty clear that if we're not on God's side, we're on the other side. There's lots of levels at which human beings are slaves, I think. The Bible talks about us being slaves of Satan.
Yeah.
But probably more commonly in our experience, we experience being slaves of our own desires and our own feeding ourselves. Actually, yesterday I was chatting to a guy on the train. I was sitting next to him and he's playing this game on his app. And he said, "This is really addictive," and
so you joined in? You showed him some cheats.
Oh, I was interested. No, I don't know anything about it. The fidget spinner thing, but anyway, he just couldn't stop doing it. He'd flicked this thing trillions of times. He told me,
So someone who was a slave to his passions or desires.
Yeah, that's a very simple thing, I think, but at a very basic level, we're pretty much enslaved to looking after ourselves, and that has implications for relationships with other people.
But you're saying that Jesus redeems us from that?
Yes, and from the consequences of it, which I don't think we understand, how horrendous it is.
But perhaps Jesus did, that's why he was feeling
overwhelmed. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think we really understand the consequences of declaring ourselves autonomous from God. We don't think it's a big deal, because we think we're in control of our life, our circumstances, whatever.
Yeah.
But Jesus, of all people, knows how horrendous that is. Yeah.
Well, so going a little farther, Jesus fell to the ground in this passage we were looking at and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. So what's this hour that he's talking about?
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? He knows that he's going to be killed the next day. So that's the hour of him making that sacrifice that would fix up this whole problem of our alienation from God. And that's what he's been working towards all his life. If you look at John's Gospel earlier on, people try to kill him, but they don't because his hour hasn't come. But here he says, this is it. Time's up.
The time's up. This is the
job's got to be done.
Judgment day, so to speak.
Yeah, for him. Yeah.
Now, some object to this, though, and say that if the purpose, as you've mentioned, of Jesus coming into the world was for him to die, then surely God would pray for thanks for God to quicken the coming hour and enable him to fulfill his destiny. But exactly the opposite's depicted here. Rather than praying for his destiny to be fulfilled quickly, Jesus prays that it could be averted. Why is that?
I think he's just facing the horror of what it's going to mean, and maybe a little bit like, you've got a big project on and you've done all the preparation and it's about to be launched. And you just realise how huge it is and what a massive risk it is if it goes wrong and all that. And we all have these moments. Why did I get into this, Usually happens about 6 weeks after your kids are born.
Okay, we'll talk to your kids after to see if they still feel that way. But Jesus seems to be approaching death very differently to other historical figures. So, for example, the famous Greek philosopher Socrates was tried and sentenced to death by drinking a cup of poison hemlock. Yet he faced death quite cheerfully, without tremor, with no change of colour or expression. So why was Socrates' approach to death radically different to Jesus's?
It's a good question. I can't really answer for Socrates, but again, I think we don't really understand the enormity of death, of having to face up to God and of having to give answer for our rebellion against him. So my guess is Socrates, like most human beings, don't understand that. And I talk to people who say, you're just like going through a doorway, But the Bible tells a different story. It says, all of us must give account to God. And so Jesus knows that. And Jesus knows that he is going to give account or pay the price for our rebellion himself. And he knows how big a deal that is. So I'm not surprised that he's more disturbed than Socrates
was. Yeah.
Or maybe even as I would be in the face of my death.
Well, perhaps one of the reasons for Jesus' distress at his impending death is in verse 36, where Jesus says, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. So what's this cup that Jesus is talking about here? This isn't a football cup that he's talking about here, he's going to get. What is the cup?
So earlier, when Jesus' disciples, they want to take the pick positions in the kingdom, and Jesus says to them, can you drink the cup that I am going to drink? So I think in that context, it's a cup of suffering, but it refers back to the Old Testament, where all of the major prophets talk about God telling the prophet to take the cup and make the nations drink it. And it's the cup of God's wrath. It's a terrifying picture, actually. I think in Jeremiah, he says they'll take this, they'll stagger, they'll reel, and they won't get up. Because of their sin against God and their rebellion against God. He's told also to give it to God's own people, the Israelites, because they also had turned away from God and taken up other gods. So it's the cup of God's upsetness, God's anger, God's right and holy and just wrath against human sin, human rebellion against him.
But is that fair? I mean, Jesus hasn't done anything wrong.
Yeah, no, it's not fair. Anybody who's had kids, and if you blame the wrong kid for some wrongdoing, you find out pretty quickly what justice is all about.
Yeah.
So it's not fair that Jesus take it, no.
Yeah. So when you've had a conversation about Muslims about this in Pakistan, as you spent some time there, now you had a conversation once about a Muslim about this kind of concept. To tell us, what was that about? What happened?
Yeah, actually I was in a train one day and a Muslim imam came into our compartment, guy with a big long beard, and we were having a good old conversation, and the conversation turned to Jesus, and I began talking about these things and saying, Jesus came to die, to pay the price for our sins. And he got quite upset, actually. He said, that's not fair. We should pay for our own sins. And I agreed with him, of course. He said, yes, we should. But what's the consequence of that? That we die and we are eternally separated from God. That's the result of our wrongdoing and our sin. That's the consequence of it.
So how did you take that answer?
His own background, of course, he didn't want to accept it. In fact, he left the compartment fairly soon after that.
Right. So you didn't finish that conversation?
No, I think he had to rush off and do something. But he objected really strongly to the idea
that somebody else should pay for his sins.
Yeah. But I think we do that as well, don't we? You know, if someone's unjustly condemned for some crime, there's a huge outcry in the community, and they need to be compensated and all that stuff. And so again, it points to the enormity of what Jesus is doing, and his deep, deep compassion and love, even for his enemies.
But it is still unfair on Jesus. I mean, indeed, British theologian Steve Chalke once claimed that the message of the cross, which is Jesus drinking the cup of his Father's wrath, as we've just looked at, is tantamount to child abuse, a vengeful father punishing his son for an offence he's not even committed. So is Jesus' death divine child abuse?
In abuse, you have a perpetrator and you have a victim. Everything we read about the eyewitness accounts of Jesus and his own words, he never thought of himself as a victim, and I don't think God thought of himself as a perpetrator. Let me tell you a story. A friend of mine and his family and another family were out having a picnic, and their kids were swimming. It was in a lake, and the kids got into difficulty, and two of them were starting to go under. And my friend Dale, his wife said to him, Dale, do something. So Dale dived into the lake. One of the kids actually was starting to get towards the shore. He went out to the one that was in the most trouble, and he pushed her towards the shore. And he went under. And he didn't come up. He died. Now, was his wife abusing him when she said, do something? He could have sat there and said, no, don't feel like going in there. But he did. He willingly got up and dived into the lake. Now, he didn't know he was going to die. He didn't know that there were dangerous currents there, and that's why the kids were in trouble. But because he loved those kids, and they weren't his own kids, he did it. And the kid was saved and he drowned. So I think that's what's happening here, that it's not child abuse. It's God the Father and God the Son realised that in order to bring humanity back and open up this way for people to come back into relationship with God, somebody perfect, somebody innocent had to die for justice to be satisfied. And Jesus was the one, and Jesus willingly agreed to it. As you read the Gospels, he set his face toward Jerusalem. You know, he willingly went there, and the disciples said to him, don't do it, you're going to die. He just kept going. So there's nothing about the victim in it. He's totally in control, even as he's being tried a few hours after this. You know, he says, even to the guy who's condemning him, you have no authority unless it's given to you from God. And earlier on he says, I lay my life down so that I can take it up again. He willingly did it. It's a very long stretch to say that it's child abuse.
Well, thank you for sharing. That's obviously a very emotional story as you recount that. So
he was a good mate.
Yeah. So as we reflect on Jesus, obviously he was very powerful. Jesus was so powerful and his death was potentially preventable. I'm sure he could have not died if he wanted to. So then why did he die?
He came to seek and to save the lost, give his life a ransom for many. So that price needed to be paid in order to fulfil the claims of justice and in order to display God's perfect love for his people. So it's those two things working together. That's why he had to die. But he could have stepped back.
Yeah.
He could have come down off the cross the next day.
So Sam, how's this good news to you then? Perhaps maybe you could just share a little bit about how you became a Christian believer and what difference this has made to you.
Yeah, when I was a young teenager, there were a couple of things going on. I was at that stage in school where the teachers and my mentors were all saying you can dream the dream, you can be whatever you want to be, do whatever you want to do. And I thought, yeah, fantastic. You know what you're like when your body's getting bigger and your head's getting bigger. You think you can do anything.
Yeah.
However, I did observe when the Olympics were on, there wasn't a lot of space on the gold medal podium. So there were billions of people who were going to miss out on that one. But anyway, that's another thing.
Yeah.
So that was going on. But at the same time in my personal life, there were things beginning to happen that I didn't like. Mm-hmm. I was starting to use bad language, and it's a fairly small thing, really, I guess.
But it made you feel uncomfortable, or?
Yes, and I didn't want to do it. Mm-hmm. I wanted to stop doing it. And I tried really, really hard, and I couldn't. Mm-hmm. And so I said to myself, I haven't tried hard enough. Well, by the end of this school term, I will have stopped. Mm-hmm. And it got worse. And so I'm putting these two things together in my head, and I think, okay, actually, my life is not in my control. I can't control these fairly simple things. I'm going to control the big things. Mm-hmm. And so that's when it all made sense to me, what I'd been told, that Christ came to fix that. He came to forgive that, get rid of that, the penalty and the guilt of sin, and to free us to live a life of serving him. Mm. And of course, then I realised too that my dreams were pretty puny compared to what he had in mind for the universe. So it's been a long journey of...
So what happened? So what happened to your language?
It cleaned up.
Yeah. And so what difference has it made to you then? You mentioned you feel somewhat free?
Yes. I still struggle with doing the wrong thing.
Yep.
But I think I've been freed from the enslavement of trying to get my own way all the time, to serve God and get his way all the time, or as much as I can. Yeah, so I think it's freed me up to respond to God and to reach out to others without that load of failure and guilt.
And trying to prove yourself.
Yeah, trying to prove myself. Yeah.
So why is an encounter with Jesus in Gethsemane so important to you?
Well, I think it shows us the core of who he is and what he came to do. And I think too that it also, I think, shows us how humanity responds to Jesus without him changing us. Mm-hmm. So you've got those three disciples who...
Yeah, they keep falling asleep.
They keep falling asleep. Jesus comes back, wakes them up, they fall asleep again.
I don't think anyone in our audience is falling asleep just yet, so I'll just...
I can see a few who are on the verge.
Okay. It's okay. We'll point them out. So that'll keep them awake. Yeah. So the disciples, they're falling asleep. Yeah, this is the response perhaps to what's going on here.
Yes, it tells us that they don't understand, and neither does humanity, why it's necessary for Jesus to do this. Mm-hmm. But I think it also points to a deeper thing, that actually Jesus has to do this alone.
Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Because he alone has lived the perfect life, so he alone can make that perfect sacrifice. Mm. And so there is a real sense in which the disciples cannot help him. They didn't want to, but they can't either. I don't think they understood that. But I think it's a bit of a picture God's giving us here of how this plays out. That there's only one who can do this. Mm.
Well, the section concludes with Jesus returning to his disciples a third time and finds them sleeping again. He says to them, "Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." So do you think this moment signifies the answer to Jesus' prayer of anguish?
Yeah, I think so. He's prayed, "If it be possible, let this cup pass from me." And then, of course, he said, "Not my will, but your will be done." Mm-hmm. And so from that, I think it's clear that Jesus knows that the answer is he has to do it. Mm. And he will do it. He wants to do it. Mm. But he's just grappling with the enormity of it.
It's obviously a very painful, difficult thing for him to do.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Now, a couple of other questions have come in. I'm fine that there might be a cost to sin. Actions have consequences. But why is the cost of salvation blood and death? Why are these the currency of this economy? It's possibly an economist has asked that question, perhaps, or an accountant. So why is the cost of salvation blood and death?
Yeah, way back in the beginning, with the first people, with Adam and Eve, God said, he gave them everything. And they're living in a paradise, and he said, "There's one thing I don't want you to do. Don't eat the fruit of that tree." And he said, "If you do it, you'll die." Mm-hmm. And of course they did it. And so just that way back in the beginning, God said that's the way things are. So I think right at the beginning, he's saying the seriousness of living a life with God out of the equation is very, very deep and big. Mm-hmm. It's not a small thing.
Mm. So he gave us life in the first place.
Yes, that's right. Again, I think it points to the justice of God, that this thing is very, very serious, and God knows that if we pay the price for it, that's it, game over. You know, we
kind of do, don't we? If we die,
Yes.
we've kind of paid for separation from the source of life.
Yes,
suppose.
yeah, and that's much bigger spiritual implications as well.
Another question is, why should I care about being eternally separated from God if He's even there?
Good question.
Oh, good. That's what we
Yeah,
asked.
yeah.
We asked them here. The bigger questions.
Why should you care about it?
Yeah, about being eternally separated from God.
Two reasons. I think, firstly, you're missing out on so much. God has created you for a relationship with Himself. So, I mean, that's a truly wonderful thing. But the other thing is that the consequences of living a life apart from God are so severe. Most people in our culture say, well, I don't believe God exists, but maybe I could use this illustration. If I get pulled up for speeding, it's not going to change much if I say to the cop, look, I don't believe you exist. That's not going to wash.
You could try.
Yeah, you could try. Now, I don't want to portray God as a policeman, but
in some senses, what you're saying here is that He's a dispenser of justice, and a police officer
Yes.
is a dispenser of justice. And
That's
so
right.
in that sense, that's the role that particular character fulfills.
yes, but He's a loving dispenser of justice, so that actually what we learn in the garden is that, yep, we get the ticket, but He pays the fine. He's a loving, just, holy God.
So, Sam, why did Jesus have to die?
To save us, to rescue us. There was no other way for that to happen.
For justice to happen?
For justice to happen, and also for His love to be fully displayed and manifest, so that we could understand how incredibly deep and unconditional and wonderful His love is.
Let me leave you with the Bible's answer to the big question, did Jesus have to die? Mark 14:36. Abba, Father, He said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. I look forward to you joining us next time for bigger questions. Please thank our guest today, Sam Reeve.